Welcome. I am Tom Hyrie. I'm the Florence Farrington Librarian of Houghton Library and the Director of Arts and Special Collections of the Harvard College Library. And I have to tell you, it's an incredible thrill to have you all here tonight. We've had this date circled on our calendar for months, and we're really excited that it's finally here. As most or all of you will know, we have been celebrating Houghton's 75th anniversary throughout the year. And this semester already, we've had events focused on faculty, on students, on staff, and many others. And we see tonight's events as pulling the whole thing together for a true anniversary celebration. It's highly fitting to have Ann Blair with us here tonight to deliver the George Parker Winship Lecture. The Winship Lecture is named after the famed bookman George Parker Winship, and it was established by the John Barnard Associates in 1966 to celebrate broadly the history of the book, bibliography, and their intersections with rare book libraries and special collections. Afterwards, we invite you all over to Houghton Library for a reception, a final opportunity to see the spectacular exhibition HIST 75H, a masterclass on Houghton Library, and most importantly, for the launch of our new publication, Houghton Library at 75, a celebration of its collections. To start us off this evening, we've invited Sarah Thomas to offer a few remarks. Sarah is the Roy E. Larson Librarian for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Vice President for the Harvard Library, and University Librarian. Sarah has been a remarkably strong supporter of Houghton Library and the other special collections and archives on campus, and I feel fortunate to be able to turn things over to her.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really add my welcome to you. It's wonderful to be here. We have, as Tom said, have anticipated this such a long time. Now, one of my predecessors was Kais Metcalf, who was librarian of Harvard for, from the 30s into the, I don't know, actually now 57 or something like that. And he lived to a very great age. But I've had fun looking at some of his annual reports where he's anticipating the need. And it seems to be, it's always very humbling actually to be the head of a library. And then you look at and you think you're encountering these issues. For you, it feels like the first time. But actually, all of my predecessors are always railing about how they're not enough space. And Widener Library, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2015, was, although thought to be for the ages, and one looks at it and it's enormous, of course, it was outgrowing its space. And in the 30s, Metcalf was already hatching this idea of what he would do to alleviate those space pressures. And we see in Houghton Library, celebrating its 75th, and in Lamont Library, actually two of his plans that came to fruition. I think of this, I do want to say that he was partnering then with one of Tom's predecessors, William Jackson, who was, I would say librarians, I often feel like I'm the administrator, I'm solving those problems of space and money and personnel, but then you need someone with great vision. And I think Jackson brought to this opportunity enormous vision and also the ability to help conjure up the funds to make it happen. And I was imagining, as I was thinking about today, what it feels like as someone, for me, when I was first married, and you're anticipating that day that you will have children, and then you're you're pregnant and you're reading all those baby books about how you will bring up this child. They were doing that. They were planning this building. They were anticipating. You have all the excitement that leads up, and then one day those doors open, and you have that opportunity. And when you're holding that infant in your arms, you're imagining all the futures that lie ahead for that child. And Houghton has lived through so many of those futures. Now I think my analogy is going to break down a bit here, because at 75, and those of us who are getting closer to 75, we feel those creaks sometimes in our bones. But I think that what happens, unlike a human, the building continues to move ahead. And when you think of a university such as Harvard, which is deep into its 4th century, we know that we are not just looking at the past of this building and all the lives it's touched, the people who built it, the people who worked in it, the people who came and researched in it, the collections that have grown with it. But we are looking ahead to multiple futures over many years, quadruple those 75 years, I would say. So I feel at this moment, it's interesting to look at Babar there and think of a children's book, Babar coming to Houghton. I feel that we are both celebrating the long past of Houghton Library, but even more with excitement looking forward to its future as it will build under Tom's leadership, under the colleagues many of whom are here today, and then our successors who will continue to solve the problems of space, the problems of money, the problems of all the administrative aspects, but then the grand challenges of life. And what is the role of a special collections library in the 21st century? We have many opportunities ahead of us, and I hope you will join me in celebrating them today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Back to me. When considering the grand sweep of history documented in the holdings of Houghton Library, 75 years may not seem like all that long of a time. And even at Harvard, 75th anniversary may not seem as impressive as some others. So it's important to remind ourselves that what we are celebrating tonight is the opening of what was then a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to preserving cultural heritage, producing new scholarship, and educating students through the acquisition, preservation, and study of rare books and manuscripts. Thinking on a grander scale, the opening of Houghton Library can be traced back to the earliest days of the university, when the clergyman John Harvard bequeathed a gift of 400 books to the university, which was named in his honor. The story of the naming of the university highlights the centrality and necessity of books, and by extension, the library to Harvard. It also set a precedent of generosity that has lived on through centuries at Harvard, as each generation has seen sons, daughters, and friends of the university follow in John Harvard's footsteps, committing their own books, their collections, and resources to the library. Tonight we celebrate this tradition, and we remember Arthur Houghton Jr., whose tremendous act of generosity allowed Houghton Library to be built. And we're fortunate to have some members of the Houghton family here with us tonight, so we welcome you. We are also thankful that this tradition extends to this very day, and I want to offer my deepest gratitude to the many donors and supporters of Houghton and Harvard Library, especially those of whom we have with us here this evening. The opening of Houghton Library on February 28, 1942, that we celebrate tonight, was fundamentally an act of optimism. That date was less than 3 months removed from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the newspapers and newsreels carried difficult news from the war in the Pacific and in Europe on a daily basis. Harvard was in the midst of a transformation in which most of its curriculum and research agenda would become dedicated to wartime concerns. By the end of the war, more than 27,000 students, alumni, faculty, and staff would serve in the armed forces, and almost 700 would die. In that setting, the university staged a relatively modest ceremony to open and dedicate the library, at which President James Conant and Arthur Houghton spoke briefly. Referencing the war, Houghton spoke of the responsibility of safeguarding education in its broadest and most liberal sense. The preservation of the records of scholarship and of truth will make it possible to bring forth a more enlightened civilization in the peace that will follow war. Conant called the founding of the library an act of peace in time of war and concluded his remarks by invoking the ancient duty of a company of scholars to cherish the creative spirit of mankind and treasure those things which the world will not willingly let die. So I have been quoting from these remarks liberally throughout the winter and spring for inspiration and because we continue to feel the responsibility and duty so wonderfully articulated by our predecessors. Today we would speak of humankind and be sure to define the concept of scholars ecumenically to include librarians, archivists, students, donors, and other friends passionate about our mission. But we still understand our own work as building links in a long chain of custodians that stretches backward and forward through time, doing our part and our best to make sure our cultural heritage can be preserved and understood for generations to come. As we think back upon Houghton Library's 75 years, we can confidently state that we have lived up to the faith and mission on which this library was founded. Houghton has grown tremendously in these 75 years, attracting collections of rare books, manuscripts, archives, and many other materials of astonishing quality and quantity. More importantly, these collections and our brilliant and dedicated staff have facilitated the pursuit and discovery of knowledge in a diverse and numerous array of disciplines and contributed to the education of countless students. As much as we appreciate our past, anniversaries ought not to be about nostalgia, but more importantly, the opportunity to consider critically our current moment and our future. Today, we find ourselves in a moment of unease in which many of us sense a kind of existential threat to the values of Houghton, Harvard, and the country as we've known it. Education, in its most broad and liberal sense, as Arthur Houghton put it, feels imperiled. Within the university and higher education in general, we hear narratives about the decline of the humanities. More often than we like, we field flippant questions about why libraries are even necessary in the age of Google, the smartphone, and the many other technologies that continue to change how we create, store, exchange, and preserve knowledge and information. So, though this backdrop presents serious challenges, like our predecessors, I am filled with optimism about the future of Houghton and Harvard Library, which we are well positioned to have an expanded impact on the university and for the public good. We look to seize the opportunities afforded by new technologies to connect scholars, students, and others to the collections of the libraries as never before, and to support new types of research and teaching that answer questions formerly too complex to even ask. At the same time, we remain committed to the physical objects of books, manuscripts, and so much more. This commitment grows in significance as we have an increasingly disembodied relationship to what we read, view, and consume. The ability to connect with physical artifacts drawn from around the world and surviving decades, centuries, and even millennia gives us an enhanced understanding of our own existential nature. So let us take Houghton's 75th anniversary as an occasion for renewal, reinvigoration, and rededication, valuing the pursuit of knowledge and truth, fostering critical thinking and understanding of the past, encouraging inquiry and discovery, and welcoming others to join us in preserving a diverse cultural heritage. We have the perfect speaker to help us with this task tonight. Blair is the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor of History here at Harvard University. Anne was our top choice to give a lecture this evening on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of Houghton Library for many reasons. Most importantly, her scholarship has helped us ground the work of contemporary libraries and librarians in historical precedent. Anne is simply one of the greatest historians of the book working today, and we are incredibly fortunate to have her here at Harvard. But Anne's connection with Houghton in particular is a special one. Anne worked at Houghton while an undergraduate, retrieving materials for researchers. And in fact, I am told that she is the original stack girl. Here's the truth. Anne still works at Houghton. Her teaching and research bring her to the library regularly, and I cannot imagine a faculty member more generous of her time and energy on behalf of Houghton and the library at Harvard in general. Anne's kindness and generosity are only outmatched by her brilliance. Her lecture tonight is titled, "The Objects of Houghton Library, Past, Present, and Future," and I ask you to join me in welcoming her tonight.
Thank you so much. It's really a thrill to be here. Some of you may have been here for the 50th and more for the 25th. I'm honored to be here for the 75th. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to take the opportunity, following on the wonderful comments of both Sarah and Tom, to reflect on what Houghton Library is, has been, and we trust will long continue to be, and on the nature of libraries more generally. A library is a place. A library is people. A library is, of course, books and all those other objects it's there to preserve and make accessible. And finally, a library is a set of objects in the sense of goals, which motivate all the investments of resources made in the place, the people, and the physical objects. We are at a time of change, and not all libraries have fared very well. This, on the upper left, is the History Department Library, which now houses a foosball, and I think it's doing very well as a lounge space for graduate students. Houghton Library, on the other hand, is playing a bigger and bigger role every day in the educational mission of the college and the university, hosting students in direct contact with the amazing objects in these collections. As others have mentioned, Houghton is an award-winning building designed by the Boston firm Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn, which opened in 1942 as the first library of its kind in the US that is dedicated to rare books and manuscripts with special attention to security and climate control needs. And one of motivation was to offload Widener, which, although it had only been founded 25 years earlier, had already filled its 50-plus miles of shelf space, filling up faster than expected. So Houghton's earliest holdings came from the treasure room in Widener and from the stacks there. And then, of course, it immediately grew due to generous bequests, such as that of Arthur Houghton Jr. of the class of 1929, who also funded the building itself, and Philip Hofer of the class of 1921, who was also curator of printing and graphic arts. And, of course, Houghton also pursued an ambitious acquisitions policy. So it soon was full up and started expanding underground on the basement levels of Pusey and Lamont for a total of 6 miles of shelving. The building hasn't changed much since 1942, as you can see, and it has lovely rooms, fancy rooms inside, which don't often get viewed. I highly recommend the tour. I think Thursdays at 3, Fridays at 3, something like that. Fridays at 2, thank you. The Richardson room, the Hyde room, the reading room, and then I won't show you a picture of the Edison and Newman room because you'll all be going there shortly to visit the exhibit. This is one change to the building since the 50th, which was removing the bridge, 2004, and I'm very grateful to members of the staff for finding this lone picture of the interior of the bridge. It was a time when these card catalog drawers seemed no longer necessary, and that's what filled the bridge. I am told that these card catalog drawers have not disappeared. They've gone to depository, so they can be called up, and indeed in the back spaces of Houghton there are still other smaller card catalogs. So some change physically, but the biggest change surely in the last 25 years is that Houghton inhabits a whole new kind of space on the World Wide Web. Houghton is a Twitter account, Instagram, Facebook accounts, each with thousands of followers, 5 blogs, a Tumblr feed, and you have to see this. This is an item that you'll see on exhibit, the giant folio, which is beautifully prepared with so-called Vulvals. These are cutouts of paper, hand-colored, and stuck around a piece of string. You won't be able to turn said Vulvals in this Appian Astronomicum Caesareum in the exhibit, but you can see how this digital rendering of how it turns is a valuable tool in teaching astronomy, basically, in the 16th century. And then it's also an AskMe feature. And of course, many thousands, I don't have an exact count, I was told it was pending, of fully and partially digitized books and manuscripts freely available on Hollis to anyone with an internet connection, sometimes even with notes and bibliographies. And these new resources are lasting achievements that result from major investments of efforts over the last years, and I hope we and generations to come will continue to maintain them and add to them, to use them and enjoy them. I think the web often seems like it has substituted itself, it's made things less personal. But actually, in terms of library access, I think the web is a fascinating way for people to meet the people behind the scenes in the library. And if you use the comment function, you will get an answer. If you use the Ask Me function, you will get an answer. And it's a wonderful way to realize that Houghton Library is people. Fantastic people. Catalogers, curators, conservators, bibliographers, librarians, 45 staff members of amazing skill, expertise, dedication, who are always eager to help researchers and students. So here I have a novel way of representing the staff of Houghton Library. I'll invite you to try and find John Harvard, who has a different lower body than the others. But since it's slightly difficult, I will point him out to you, along with a few other people whom I'd especially like to thank, because much of the information behind these statistics comes from people inside Houghton Library who know much more than I do about it. I can't think of a library of this importance which is as accessible and friendly as Houghton Library. I vividly remember one European colleague commenting a few years ago that working in the manuscript room of his own home university was kompliziert, complicated. It was meant to make me feel good about the difficulties I was having in negotiating my way through the institution. But above all, it was a powerful reminder of how fortunate we are, not only to have a library with amazing holdings, but also amazing librarians who routinely go far beyond anything one could reasonably expect to make materials available to us as directly and as easily as possible. Houghton has become a huge attraction to Harvard courses. In 2016, Houghton welcomed 2,868 students in 283 classes. These ranged from courses in math and computer science, which are kind of what one wouldn't expect, and here are the selections of the colleagues involved in those courses, which are on exhibit, from government, and of course from the humanities and the histories. Mainly from Harvard, but not exclusively. They also host classes from Boston area schools. And that's a tremendous extra workload that Houghton staff absorb, but everyone seems to have embraced this expanding role with great enthusiasm. The tours are great too, but these sessions are really hands-on in a seminar room around the objects themselves. These are the oldest things that you or I or our students will probably ever get so close to. These sessions resonate vividly with students who mention they're the best part of a course or even the best part of their whole Harvard experience. And they create an immediate connection, sometimes to a distant past, but also to not such distant past. The students are amazed to see telegrams or typescripts, for example, which are distant for them too. And as a result, students every year fall in love with some aspect of book culture, and they go on to become book professionals. Among them, James Capobianco, class of 1999, who is now reference librarian at Houghton and responsible for the Houghton History 75H, which is so realistic a depiction of a Harvard class that as DUS in history, I actually sent around a little note to everyone explaining this. It wasn't a real Harvard class. If anybody came along being confused, they should disabuse them of that. Or Robert Darnton, one of the luminaries in the field of book history, our own university librarian, 2007 to 15, who remembers as a freshman walking into Houghton Library, that's for James, and staff favorites coming soon, I'm told, mid-May, it sounds like. Here is Robert Darnton's selection for the exhibit you'll see. He describes as a freshman coming into Houghton and looking at Melville's copy of Emerson's essays, and noting this annotation by a rather grumpy Melville to this line which is starred, in which Emerson wrote, "The drover, the sailor buffets it all day, and his health renews itself as vigorous a pulse under the sleet as under the sun of June." Melville's comment, "To one who's weathered Cape Horn as a common sailor, what stuff all this is." So he remembered that many years later when the opportunity presented. Who knows what our current undergraduates will go on to do? I know some who've gone off to be book artists and sort of book restorers. I'm delighted that one senior I know who's concentrating in statistics and is going off to work at Google will have been into Houghton and really have a sense of the long history of the codex form, thanks to Houghton's accessibility. Some of them are also lucky to have summer fellowships at Houghton Libraries. It's a wonderful new program which brings on 5 or 6 students every summer to work on a range of topics that are of interest to the libraries, from James John Audubon's drawings, for example, to fanzines, fan fiction of the 1970s. Houghton is people, therefore. But of course, Houghton is books and related objects. These are the items that Houghton is here to safeguard and transmit, but also to showcase and to provide access to. We call them books, but of course they take many forms. Here is Kathleen Coleman's favorite papyrus. You can notice that it's by a Greek orator, Isocrates, from the 5th century, and this copy is from approximately 600 years later. It has, of course, not survived very well, papyrus being a medium that, barring exceptional circumstances like being in a jar in the Dead Sea caves, doesn't come along very well more than a few hundred years. There are other kinds of scrolls, too, though, on parchment, like this lovely Genealogy of Christ, French 13th century, which was on display at the Beyond Words exhibit that you may have seen during the fall semester in the Boston area, not just at Houghton, but also at Boston College and at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. Other things that you'll notice, this is a piece of advertisement on a blotter, which was not a medium I was aware of, but I gather that it was meant to be on the underside of a rocking blotter, and presumably you were supposed to tip your blotter on its side so that you'd be able to be entranced by the advertisement lying underneath it. Obviously, this is the kind of ephemera that is very rare and valuable today, because at the time it was a throwaway item. Another such a piece of ephemera, that started off as ephemera, is this wanted poster seeking the assassins of Abraham Lincoln, but it's been turned into memento after the fact by the addition of those carte de visite of the 3 perpetrators, so you can see that it acquired commercial value as a memento close to the time. Obviously, Houghton Library has long collected items of great beauty. Here is a sequence from the Mass copied by nuns in 14th century Westphalia. Of great significance, here's a manuscript of Keats's Ode to Autumn. You can see the poet at work revising. And here is another item of beauty, a special, a limited edition print with hand painting, so numbered copies 1 through 50. But our libraries treat equally carefully items which actually seemed of no importance at the time they were acquired, when they were bequeathed to the institution. And I especially like this item with an accompanying letter in which Grosvenor Hubbard, a descendant of Jonathan Trumbull, from the class of 1727, is writing to the Harvard College librarian in 1909, "I send you a notebook with scribblings by Jonathan Trumbull. It has, of course, no value except as a curiosity." And by the standards of 1909, that makes good sense. What it is a notebook taken down by a student of Aristotelian natural philosophy, basically. There are a few dozen such notebooks in various collections in Massachusetts, so it's not unique for the content that it carries, and intellectually is probably not terribly original or interesting. But 100 years after the donation, to someone like me who's interested in the pedagogy and methods of working and note-taking, this is fantastic. And actually, I'm relying on the scholarship of 2 scholars who have studied all of the surviving such notebooks and found out that basically they were not taken by dictation as it would be expected in a European setting, that the students would copy out section by section as assigned over the course of about 2 months their textbook here in natural philosophy. So we can learn a tremendous amount about what actually happened in the classroom thanks to this having been preserved for us, even though at the time it seemed kind of boring. And I'll have to say there are items in Houghton now, which well, here are some notebooks, more of the kind, and you can see how each student individualizes them. Some of them have colophons like this. In Latin, you see most of the text is in English, in fact, or adding an index or a table of contents. So it's a way of personalizing your work. It's also a time when, with a very small class size, it didn't make sense financially to print this book because you'd have to spend 50 years selling it, you know, by dribs and drabs to 10 students a year. But also the act of writing it out was considered pedagogically valuable. Now, these are some items from Houghton's Z closet. And I think they are going to await a different historian than I. They await scholarly attention. But objects are patient that way, as long as they have a safe haven like Houghton Library, which will keep them until they're called up. And here is something classed as a manuscript, which is a piece of the house in which William Caxton printed his first book in England in 1471. So Houghton has many, many goodies, objects in addition to books. These objects, of course, can prove more durable than people or even institutions. The place, at 75 years old, and the people, who are generally younger, are dwarfed in age by many of the objects in Houghton Library. How have they come down to us? They were saved by their first owners and immediate heirs of those first owners, like the Harvard Notebook, for example, came down through the family directly to the library. We also see here the case of a professorial nachlass. The scrapbook of Charles Eliot Norton, professor of art history, includes a letter in which a student is praising his stand he took in class against the Spanish-American War. But the other way that books entered Houghton Library was passing through a market. Sometimes the market has some downsides. It encourages the creation of forgeries in the hope that they will fetch money. And this is a wonderfully interesting selection. It is a late 18th century facsimile of forged, completely fake, manuscripts that were purported to be Shakespeare's, in particular here, a love letter. And you can see the making of the facsimile was in itself a huge feat, including the rendering of a lock of hair using engraving techniques. So it was, of course, very rapidly debunked, and yet it is an object of interest and value today as an example of early facsimile work. The market has a lot of virtues, ensuring the survival of many items which might have been discarded otherwise. Americans traveled to Europe to buy books, which is, of course, what Harry Elkins Widener was doing in London when he returned and drowned in the Titanic. European dealers came to the US to find buyers here. And, of course, objects considered of value have traveled and been bought at a distance. They travel across time and space. And when that object contains words, it's more likely to end up in a library than a museum, but in fact, these distinctions are porous. And there are books in museums, and there are non-textual things in libraries. But my point here is that institutions play a key role in the preservation of books, and they have done so for centuries. A few libraries have existed continuously since the Middle Ages, but many more have existed continuously since the 16th and 17th century. So if you could get something into a library then, it can have safe passage down to the present. And Harvard's library should rank, of course, among those 17th century libraries, although there is really only one book, we think, that has survived the fire of 1764. And here it is. I called it up. It comes in a beautiful red box. And it is an example of the reverse phenomenon, of a book that was checked out at the time, clearly of interest, a good 130 years after its publication, in which nonetheless now does not seem that appealing to a scholar like me to go read about the Christian warfare against the devil, world, and flesh. It's a very large folio, and I hope someone embraces it. But books will be saved nonetheless, in any case, for a long time to come. So I'd like to think a bit with you about what makes a book and or a text durable. Some items are durable because of their material form. Big books survive much better than small ones, and the Gutenberg Bible was probably printed in about 150 copies, of which there are 29 surviving copies. That is a fantastic record of survival. On the other hand, this is an indulgence. You can see it's print meant to be cut into 4. You can see on the verso there are 2 indulgences, and here there are 2 indulgences, and this would make 4 indulgences. And you can see here that it is meant to be filled in by hand with your name. After you'd purchased it, this would be proof that you had just purchased some time off purgatory, bluntly put. This kind of thing survives very little, at rates of about 0.02%, a few hundred copies out of maybe 1 million printed by 1500. And so printing helps us understand why Luther was so agitated with the flooding of indulgences, which had existed in the Middle Ages too, but just not in this incredible quantity. Some books survive not because of their content. So these are tiny Bibles, 13 Mo's, that were meant to be in a lady's pocket. And I was just at a talk at the Renaissance Society of America explaining that many of these editions of the Bible, which of course don't have any scholarly value, were never considered of importance, only survive because of the bindings were made for them, which are of course beautifully embroidered and keepsakes that were kept and passed down from mother to daughter, and even, I learned, down the mail line also. So here the text is sort of saved by accident because of the binding. Similar example, the oldest object in the collection is an Anglo-Saxon 10th century page from a benedictional, which survived only because it was included in the end papers of the binding of a later manuscript. So then we have a tension between our wanting to see the 10th century page and yet, of course, also valuing that original binding from the later Middle Ages. But, you know, I think the 10th century won out on this one. But we try to keep a record of the bindings as they were before they're disbound. And books are durable things. They can survive damage. So here, for example, is a Ben Jonson's copy of Lucretius, annotated, and then apparently ink was spilled on it, and the ink sort of burned through the paper and creates a paper burn, which is nonetheless still an object that has come down to us. So signs of use and abuse. So that's how books survive materially. But in fact, some of our oldest texts do not survive materially. Except for inscriptions on stone or on clay tablets, texts from antiquity, whether they are biblical or classical, owe their survival not to material durability, because those papyrus rolls really don't do well, but instead to cultural longevity. The texts of the Bible of ancient Greece and Rome that have come down to us were those that were central to a religious or a pedagogical or general literary canon. And that canonical status ensured that they were copied over and over again, like the Socrates. That's 600 years after he wrote, we have a papyrus fragment. And ultimately, the ones that got copied onto parchment in late antiquity with the rise of the codex are the ones that have come down to us. Once inscribed on parchment, which is quite durable, the text could survive a few centuries of neglect, which is what befell many ancient texts and even some of the biblical ones that were not in regular use. So when those texts were rediscovered in the Renaissance, there was enough cultural continuity, in fact, to make the recovery rather easy. They could turn to Byzantines to help with the Greek language. The alphabet of the Roman alphabet and the Greek alphabet was pretty much similar. And they had maintained the use of Latin. They were eager to learn. They had the cultural motivation to admire the ancient texts they were recovering. So basically, this process of recovery was not very onerous. But when there isn't cultural continuity, interpreting long-lost texts is much more fraught. You need to decipher the writing system, master the language, interpret the text, contextualize it. And texts can travel alone through time and space without cultural continuity to accompany them. So the Maya petroglyphs would be an extreme example. The stone inscriptions are doing fine, and we have no clue how to read them. We don't have the cultural legacy with which to understand them. Texts from foreign cultures require special skills in cultural understanding to read and interpret them, and Houghton, although centered on American and European materials, also has abundant collections in non-Western materials. Here's an Ottoman manuscript, and you can see I've linked to, all this is from our wonderful new Mirador system, whereby you can flip through the books And you can also download the entire thing. Very powerful. And here, for example, in Houghton, we even have this Chinese imprint, which was the work of a Jesuit missionary who's writing a conversion manual for Chinese consumption, which is in Houghton rather than Yanqing Library, where we might expect it. So a library like Houghton collects and preserves not only items that are clearly central to our cultural heritage, whether we want to think of that as American or English speaking, but also items that now seem culturally distant because of chronological or geographical distance. And a university is that place where we develop and transmit the specialized skills for conserving, understanding, and interpreting these sources of all kinds, requiring the expertise of librarians in techniques like papermaking or binding or past cataloging, to academic departments which treat the languages and cultural contexts of many different times and places. So together, libraries and universities are trying to transmit to the future physical and cultural access to as much of the heritage of human culture as we can. So texts are made more durable by redundancy, right? The creation of multiple copies. Each individual copy is at risk of loss, but the more copies you have, the better the chance of survival. And, oh yeah, where's my Horace? Oh, well, let me talk a bit about, so lots of redundant copying ensured that Horace's line that I have written something that will outlast the pyramids of Egypt, Odes 3:30, has actually come true. Not because we have what he wrote, but because he has become central to the teaching of Latin for 2,000 years, minus about a 400-year period there between the 5th and the 9th centuries, but he was safe on parchment somewhere, and the Latin transmitted despite that. That's one way you can have durability. Sometimes the multiple copies, only one survived to be read, and that's probably what happened to Lucretius. Only one copy was found in a German monastery in 1417, as beautifully told by Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve, and then put back into circulation. And of course, there were many ancient works that we know existed that don't survive at all. Maybe parchment copies were made, but they don't come down to us. For example, Aristotle's book of the Poetics on Comedy and Umberto Eco's book and movie of the same title, The Name of the Rose, makes a plot point of how that text might have become destroyed. Estimates of how much ancient literature have survived range from about 1%, which was the estimate made by humanists, in particular Pietro Bembo in the 15th century, to about 4%, which is the recent estimate of a classics scholar studying the survival of ancient plays. So then you'd say, well, printing, which began in 1453, is going to solve all these problems of preservation, right? To be commercially viable, a print run has to be at least 300 copies. By the 16th century, it's normally 1,000 copies. Even though the survival rate for printed books seems to be not that much greater than 1% on average, because to offset the Gutenberg Bible that survives at a rate of 30%, we have lots of cheap print that doesn't survive that well. And that's what this slide is about. Aristotle's complete masterpiece, we have here the 21st edition in 1738, and we have these other editions. But between the 25th and the 31st, we certainly cannot account for every single missing edition. What's happened here? Either this is like a X million hamburgers sold kind of advertisement. It's possible, but more likely simply this work, which was borderline obscene in the eyes of the educated at the time, which was very lowbrow, was not considered of sufficient value to ever end up in an institutional library, because printing alone does not carry books down to the future. It needs printing plus a library. Similarly, my selection for the exhibit is writing tablets, which combine print with these pages of hardened paper that you can write on, of which we found a handful of examples. Now that Peter Stallybrass has made us aware of these, we may find more of them. But basically, it's a very functional object, which is not collected until much later, and then anything old has some value. So basically, these cases are good reminders that even though the concept of a legal deposit library was present by the early 17th century in both France and England, clearly it was not effective. And there are many kinds of books that just don't make it into institutional libraries. So I'd want to end with talking about libraries and to turn to an author on whom I've been working lately. Oh, there's Horace's Odes. Sorry, misplaced. But we move on to Conrad Gessner, who we celebrated the 500th of his birth last year. He's a humanist, naturalist, bibliographer, physician in 16th century Zurich, a prolific author of 65 publications, many of them massive folios, and a great dedicator of his, out of the 65 books, he manages to get 102 dedications. How does he do that? He takes pieces of a book and he dedicates different parts to different people to get extra mileage. And then he will use dedications to multiple people. So he has 127 individual dedicatees plus 6 institutions. These are universities or city councils. So his first major work is this Bibliotheca Universalis, a kind of virtual library. It's often hailed as the first modern bibliography. It's trying to be exhaustive, a catalog of all authors in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, extant and not, ancient and not, learned and not, published and hiding in libraries. That is, in manuscript, right, waiting to be hunted down. He's a late humanist. There aren't that many manuscripts left, you know. The good stuff's already been printed, but he's and he did manage to score a few Editiones Principes. It's not completely modern. It's organized by first name, which seems bizarre to us, but it provides an index from last name to first name. If you know Luther, you can get Martin that way. It's not completely exhaustive, and it has some personal touches. A long bibliography where he lists his own works, and in particular, he gives shout-outs to works he wants to write and tries to invite people to fund him to write his natural history of animals, for example. He also includes a few of his friends who hadn't actually published anything in the relevant languages, but he wants to thank them, and in particular, for access to their library. So the Bibliotheca is an amazingly ambitious project taken on by a 26-year-old. It took him 3 years, and he listed 10,000 works by 3,000 authors, comparing the experience, quote, to having climbed the tallest, steepest mountain. He starts with a dedication, of course. That's one of the points of publishing a book. It's a dedication to Leonard Beck von Beckenstein, imperial counselor, and it starts with fulsome praise, of course, for the dedicatee, including this colored rendition of his coat of arms. But really what his point is, that is the fragility of transmission. It's the trauma of loss that the humanists experienced, the loss of all that great ancient and Greek literature of which we are recovering so little. And so Gessner is listing, in fact, in the Bibliotheca, lost works in the hopes that people will find them. So he's got a complex view about printing. On the one hand, he sees printing as a divine gift. To say the art of typography, granted by God to the men of our time for the preservation of letters to posterity, will supply authors of every kind. But by this art, as much is produced in one day by one man, even unskilled in letters, as it was barely possible to produce in a whole year by several men with the speediest quill. Great stuff, printing is. However, although the typographical art seems to have been born for the conservation of books, most of the time, nonetheless, the silliness of men and useless writings are edited, to the neglect of the old and better ones. For this reason, we need libraries, and libraries for manuscript books alone. In other words, we need a Houghton Library in the middle of the 16th century. He is feeling that printing brings on its own problem, this problem of overload, that the good books, by which he means the ancient texts in new editions, are being swamped by cheaper, bad books, less important books, silly books. But on the other hand, so he knows that. He's well aware, though, that printing can't survive without libraries. And actually, Gesner knows that well enough himself, because in another of his works, he offers advice on how to index a book, and he then offers you a collective index, basically, of all the books in the Bibliotheca. To index a book efficiently, you should own 2 copies of it, and you should cut and paste out of the book the passages that you want to index. You need 2 copies, so you can cut from the recto and the verso of each page. Interestingly, he doesn't talk about a 3rd copy, so you might be able to have something later on. And Gesner, in fact, does this. So here, from his Nachlass, is a work that was prepared for publication after his death, but never published. And so we have the manuscript, and you can see that it is made of slips of paper glued in. Some of them are manuscripts in Gesner's hand. Some of them are letters sent to him, but you can see here 2 printed books, a German one in the Gothic script and a Latin one. Now, some of these items did not have commercial value. When they're marked up with a red pencil, as this piece of manuscript is, it's a printer's copy being marked by the compositor and then normally would have been discarded. So we can imagine Gesner, who hangs out at the public printers all the time, preparing his own books, picking stuff off the cutting room floor, basically, finding the text of interest and filing it in his cubbies, and then sorted under headings. This is actually a thesaurus of practical medicine, of remedies sorted by disease. So Gesner knew well what might happen to books. They could be used. So what you need then is libraries. Gesner worried, he starts off this preface to Leonard Bekenstein bemoaning the loss of the Library of Alexandria with its 700,000 volumes. These might not have been, these were scrolls, not necessarily whole works, like the 8 volumes, 8 books of Aristotle might each have been a scroll. And he also bemoans the loss of many other lesser-known libraries, like the 30,000 books belonging to the grammarian Tyrannion, or even just the 2 books by Galen that Galen reported losing in a fire at the Temple of Peace. And Gesner goes on to lament recent losses, such as the pillaging of Buddha, which occurred in the memory of our fathers in 1526, which destroyed the great library formed there by Matthias Corvinus. And he exclaims, "But what now remains of all these glorious libraries except an empty reputation? So many and such precious books in every philosophy were gradually lost, some consumed by flames or the tumult of war, some by age itself, corrupted by worms or an unhealthy location, many dissipated by negligence and the hatred of barbarians for learning." His solution, then, is the Bibliotheca. I have opened a way and given a great occasion to others by which the wealthy and the princes can establish libraries which are necessary for transmitting books to posterity. So, of course, Gesner is writing to someone who he hopes will take him up on this. He hopes that Leonard Bekenstein, whom he praises for his learning and his book collection, will prove to be one of these great princes. As it happens, we don't know much else about him beyond Gesner's dedications. We don't know what happened to his library. But in fact, this personal dedication to one man, thanks to print, also becomes an open call to everyone out there. And Gesner is very adept at using the public nature of the printed book to thank people in dedications for sending him materials for his various projects, manuscripts, images, information, specimens for his natural histories in particular. And he encouraged further contributions tacitly and even very explicitly, with, for example, in one of his prefaces, calling openly for contributions from Scandinavia and Spain in particular on birds where he has too little information. And telling you, if you're going to send him something, go to a merchant in your town who visits the fairs of Frankfurt or Lyon, and they will find there someone from Zurich who will bring me what you have sent, and send me what you want in return, and I will send it back to you. So he's really using print as a call for people to contribute to his ongoing projects. But in one instance, I think Gesner is also using a printed dedication to try and pressure the owner of a great library to share his material. Diego Hurtado de Mendoza was a Spanish diplomat who served as imperial ambassador to Venice and took advantage of this terrific location to form a great library of rare Greek manuscripts, which he either purchased or had copied. And Gesner dedicates also in the same year as the Bibliotheca Universalis a new edition of his Lexicon Graeco-Latinum to Mendoza. And notice that on the title page he mentions the dedication, which is quite unusual. In the dedication, he praises the man's library, explaining, "The learned Arnoldus Arlenius Paraxylus showed me the catalog of your Greek collection. The greater part of the learned will soon know that remarkable books are hiding in your library when they read mention of them in my Bibliotheca, which I have just completed, since your name is cited every time I knew you owned a rare Greek book." And so he also lists Mendoza's library among the sources. But he never got to see any of these books. It's not clear that the dedicatee appreciated the publicity. I found no further mention of Mendoza in Gesner's life or correspondence, and Mendoza's library became property of the King of Spain at his death in 1575. Gesner addresses other great owners of libraries, typically to thank them for their generosity. Now, why do I have this here? Oh, I don't have slides of these. Basically, Gesner makes a editio princeps of Elian's natural history, and he dedicates it to Johann Jakob Fugger, thanking Fugger for the loan of your very old Greek manuscript, which he clearly edited the work from. And he goes on to say, "Welcome easily and benevolently the return of your Elian, now complete, corrected, bilingual, and published, and admit it into your library by the law of hospitality." Similarly, he dedicated an edition of Dioscorides in 1565 to the city of Augsburg, saying, "Please add this volume to your library, that ornament to your city which was begun by you and which will grow in perpetuity." So Gesner had high hopes for the preservation of his own books by getting them placed in these very nice institutional libraries of his time. Those libraries actually did serve well to preserve their contents, even though they moved around. The Duke of Bavaria purchased Fugger's collection, so it moved from Augsburg to Munich, for example, in the late 16th century. But by and large, these works have survived well, and we are not aware of missing any works of Gessner's, whether the lavish illustrated folios, which of course would have survived, or these cheaper works here, which I show as an example. But Gessner's works do not survive all in one place, even in his hometown of Zurich. So what made possible my project of exhaustively studying the paratext of his 65 publications was the fact that all but one of these 65 are digitized in PDF, scanned by one major European project or another, thanks especially to Gessner's standing as a famous scion of Zurich. And this brings me to my final point about the future objects of libraries. Libraries are responsible for preserving not only physical objects now, but also their digital surrogates. And both are essential for the future of transmitting to the next generation the treasures gathered by generations past. Digitization offers access across geographical distance in powerful ways and promises a form of preservation and backup, as long as resources are devoted to maintaining them, because they do require resources, in addition to new kinds of expertise. But digitizations are also no substitute for the objects themselves. They're convenient for when you know what you're looking at. But to make good use of a digitization, you first need experience with books themselves. And it's only by coming into Houghton that students can experience how the objects relate to their digitizations. They can see how a book is put together. They can try to figure out what's going on here with this typescript manuscript of Marguerite Yourcenar, the first woman admitted to the Académie Française. And what's happening is she has used Scotch tape to tape on corrections to her material. So the tape is aged, the little pieces of paper are slipping around, and the digitization gives you some sense of this, but obviously seeing the object itself is much more effective. A couple of caveats I learned about digitizations from my Gesner project. We will always use digitizations, and we should use them. But we have to remember that a digital copy is just one copy. It's going to become the most convenient copy and the most widely used copy. But this copy of Gessner Bibliotheca, which is the only one digitized to my knowledge, is actually a very unique copy. It is Gessner's own copy, Handexemplar, which he has annotated on the one hand, but it turns out it actually is a bit of a preprint. It is a galley, because inside here is a major correction that was made at the very last minute. This is as compared to the widely disseminated version. Gessner's own copy, you see, has crossed out this paragraph and substitutes this paragraph up here. And in this paragraph, he is critiquing a recent edition by a Basel printer in no uncertain terms. And I think that his Zurich printer told him, we are going to have some little discussion of Serapio and the confusion of his name with other Johns and so forth. So it's a reminder that the digital copy may be particularly available, but it is just one copy, and you should make sure you know what you're dealing with. And if it's a special copy, keep that in mind. Another feature of digitization is that it often neglects things that don't fit the format of the book. So Gesner wrote this in octavo on the variety of languages, the Mithridates. Many copies have been digitized. None of them contain the fold-out table at the back, even though the catalog record for the particular copies that were digitized states the table is present. Unfortunately, Zurich, where I have a few connections, the table isn't present. So they would have gone to the trouble of digitizing it. I don't know anybody in Munich, but maybe someone will give me a connection. And so this fold-out is fantastic. I saw it at the Countway Library when I realized the situation. I mean, that's what made me realize it was going to Countway to see this. It's the Lord's Prayer in 23 different languages. Also from the Countway Library is my realization of something that really isn't visible at all in this otherwise high-quality digitization of a medical dictionary where Gessner had a part, so it was part of my corpus. And you can see here a page opening. You have a Latin dedication and then the Greek text. It's a piece by Hippocrates. Nothing comes to mind. If you look at the book itself, suddenly you realize there are these two little stubs of paper and a little bit of ink on one of them. This is a cancel. The first 2 pages of the book were different originally. They were cut out, and 2 new sheets were introduced, the title page and the dedication. And I just wouldn't have noticed at all if it hadn't been for seeing the book itself. And of course, we can't know what the original dedication was. The new dedication does explain that the book had been printed much earlier than it was sold, and probably the dedicatee in the meantime was no longer seemed appropriate. So it's unlikely to have been really juicy stuff. But nevertheless, once you know that there's a cancel here, you can actually see it in the changing font of that gathering, here in Roman and there in italic, but I'm not going to look at my PDFs that closely. And so I really want the book to tell me about this. So basically, I would just say at 75, Houghton is a mature institution, bursting with books and people, but also young at heart, bustling with activity, embracing the digital to improve interactions with the public, and invigorating the appreciation of books at a time when our students are drawn to other media. A key partner in our collective goal of interpreting and transmitting unique objects of cultural heritage, but also the expert knowledge from which future generations will, we hope, carry the project forward. So I wish us all a long and productive future, and especially to the institution, which will outlive us all. Thank you.
I would normally ask Anne to take questions, but I'm going to use her availability back at Houghton Library as even one more incentive to ask you to come back for our reception. But I do want to thank her one more. That was a spectacular.